Feel free to return to our channel at any time. Jim Gordon was the musical genius at its core. His exceptional drumming abilities could make any song famous. His rhythms were more than just ambience. They played an essential role in iconic rock songs. Songs like Layla, You're So Vain, and Ricky Don't Lose That Number all had his beats. Both his brilliance and his evil were obvious. An angry, paranoid, and violent tempest was hiding underneath the disciplined musician's lovely exterior. Behind closed doors, the truth about Gordon remained concealed for years. His talent and worth were too great to ignore. His increasing impulsivity was a secret that was both dangerous and tolerated because of his drumming talent. Bobby Whitlock, who was Derek and the Dominos bandmate, has suddenly lifted the veil, decades after the fact. The revelations he is making are shaking the foundations of rock music. The idolized Jim Gordon was more than just a handful. He was a monster waiting to happen. Layla and other love songs come to mind. An album filled with unadulterated, unrestrained feeling. A musical masterwork that sounded like a confessional gushing out of Eric Clapton's heart. The guitars howling, the lovers' cries of despair, the piano outro's painful notes. The sound of broken hearts was captured forever. The sadness wasn't limited to the words, either, and that was something that most fans didn't know. It seemed to be floating around the studio. Jim Gordon was at the center of the band's internal strife and stress, which manifested in the group's dynamics. He cast an eerie shadow over every single rehearsal and recording session. Although he was short in stature, he made up for it with his commanding presence and the utmost respect for his authority. Jim Gordon wasn't your average drummer. He was a formidable adversary. He exuded an electric intensity that drew attention away from others and made them feel uneasy. Bobby Whitlock seen it unfolding repeatedly. As the man's actions went from controlling to frightening, he stood by Gordon's side. His obsession with detail, which was previously admirable, was now intolerable. In Jim Gordon's universe, mistakes were not tolerated. Complete and utter adherence to his interpretation of the music is required. They would also find out if one of their bandmates wasn't interpreting the music accurately. It started off as mere words. Constructive, scathing critiques that pierced deeply. For what he saw as average performance, he had zero tolerance. There was zero slack for what he thought was ineptitude. He would make fun of, scold, or mock someone if he thought a note was off-key or the speed was slow. The contempt in his words was palpable, discreetly warning with a grin. Do it correctly or go. Another item, though, was present. It was the rapidity with which his emotions could change. At one point, he was totally focused on his work and never wavered from his method. After this, it was like a light went out. In an instant, his whole manner would shift as his eyes grew darker and his body tensed. For a while, he was engrossed in the groove and tapping out rhythms. Suddenly, he was staring across the room with his fists clenched and his teeth grinding, his rage just bubbling to the surface. Eventually, the pent-up fury became unbearable. It occurred during a practice, during a song that was supposed to be simply rehearsed. However, something seemed off. Perhaps an indication went unnoticed. The manner a chord was played might have irritated Gordon. Maybe it was completely insignificant. However, in an explosion of unbridled rage, he violently reacted physically, shoving, slapping, and possibly even more. The others couldn't respond since everything happened so quickly. Then there was a long pause after an angry outburst. Nobody budged. Discord reigned. Angry outbursts were nothing new to them. There had been a fight of musicians they had witnessed. Yet there was a noticeable change with this. Because of this, nobody dared to confront him. No, not just yet. However, the dynamic within the band was poisoned by more than simply his fury. It wasn't the only thing. It was a personal and cunning treachery that would make the truth-tellers sick to their stomachs. There it was, tucked away in the famous piano outro of Layla, surrounded by beautiful, melancholy tones. Music so lovely, so tragically sad, that it seemed like it had been plucked from the depths of someone's crushed heart. It was not, however, Jim Gordon's property. In Rita Coolidge's possession it was. For years, word had spread about the tale. The melody, written by Coolidge, a talented composer in her own right, had profound emotional significance for her. Once, in a tender moment of closeness, she had played it for Gordon, not realizing that it would shortly be taken. It was Jim Gordon who was entirely attributed with Layla's melody, conception, heart, and soul upon her release. Crime struck her. In terms of the truth, her own creative legacy, as well as earnings and acknowledgement. Everyone closest to the band, including Bobby Whitlock, knew, and the treachery and contempt it signified would remain forever. It was at this point when the band's tension finally snapped. Rather of being an environment for teamwork, the studio had become a battleground. Clapton was engrossed in his own sorrow and unable to step in and help. Whitlock, who had previously viewed Gordon as a friend, was now beginning to perceive him in his truest form. In addition to being an exceptionally gifted drummer, Jim Gordon posed a serious threat. His demise will eventually spread beyond the confines of a studio. The real world would be engulfed in it, and destruction would follow. There were forewarnings long before Jim Gordon was associated with a horrific crime that shook the world and became a cautionary tale whispered in the dark by people who had formerly held him in high esteem. Flares of brilliant crimson light up the shadows within him. Still, nobody did anything. No one paused to consider the extent to which that shadow extended. Were they attentive? Had they really perceived him in his truest form? Maybe things might have turned out differently. If Gordon hadn't been so furious, Rita Coolidge might not have been left alone on the floor of the hotel corridor, her body sagging under his weight. Their connection appeared to be tailor-made at first. A couple of up-and-coming musicians, consumed by the euphoria of stardom, recording sessions, and late-night jam sessions with music superstars. Unlike other background voices, Coolidge had an impact. Unstoppable, she was. This singer-songwriter had an undeniable skill and an arresting stage presence. Greats like Chris Christopherson, Leon Russell, and Stephen Stills were her collaborators. Still, Gordon drew her in some way. Perhaps it was his charisma, that air of relaxed self-assurance that he displayed when his demons weren't consuming him. Perhaps it was his controlled, methodical, and tight drumming style. However, when Gordon was playing the drums, he truly possessed control. It was as easy as sand to slip through his fingers everywhere else. Even though his personality flaws had always been there, at first they were simple to ignore. The expression was more calculated than admiring. There was a cold silence, a harsh statement, and a longing gaze. However, the fissures became wider and wider with the passage of time. And Coolidge eventually found herself standing on shakier ground. Then something snapped. The iconic tour starring Joe Cocker and an all-star roster of musicians, Mad Dogs and Englishmen, was supposed to make this visit as routine as any other. Despite the tremendous energy and electrifying performance, the events that transpired that evening in the hotel hallway were unrelated to the music. Nothing to do with intense feelings, fiery arguments, or passionate love. Excuse me, but this was totally different. Gordon turned on her out of the blue, without any provocation whatsoever. Recall that exact time. The next thing you know, they're strolling hand in hand, maybe chatting about the play, maybe laughing, maybe deep in meditation, and suddenly, something changes. She didn't have time to grasp the unexpected turn of events before her body gave out from the shock of a blinding force and a rapid, too fast movement. She felt the cold floor against her skin as she slipped back into consciousness, which was followed by darkness and a throbbing pain that spread through her skull. Feeling bewildered, she opened her eyes wide, hoping to feel the reassuring presence of someone. However, she did not feel a helping hand extended toward her. There was no one asking whether she was all right or muttering an apology. Alone she stood. Jim Gordon was no longer there. There was no hesitancy, regret, or justification. While if she were insignificant and expendable, he had abandoned her while she lay there. This wasn't an angry outburst motivated by emotion. A dispute that got out of hand wasn't involved. It was an assault without feeling or logic, an act of utter, unadulterated brutality. The fact that nobody cared about it only added to the horror. The music industry saw rock stars as gods and Rita Coolidge as an outsider, a woman in a very male-dominated field. Outspoken women were disregarded. Violators were protected. People were interested in the music and the records, but they weren't interested in the behind-the-scenes drama. There were no repercussions, no negative reaction, and no reprimand for Gordon. No one in the label executive's inner circle brought up the subject. No journalist investigated, and no one whispered about it in the industry. His reputation and career were unharmed, so he just continued on. However, others who had witnessed the reality, experienced his violent outbursts firsthand, and witnessed the transformation of his creative enthusiasm into something much more sinister understood better. Bobby Whitlock noticed it. Seemed to Eric Clapton. Those in his inner circle, including those he worked with and traveled with, could see it. He was more than just a disturbed individual. This wasn't your run-of-the-mill musician giving in to the temptations of stardom. This was someone who had really survived the decade's excesses. Something much more terrible was this. Reality was slipping away from Jim Gordon. No longer were his demons merely lurking in the background. They had already taken control, and the bomb was about to go off.